The storm, before the fall, the night sky over Manhattan was a restless canvas of gray and silver, where thunder rolled in the distance like the low growl of something waiting to strike. Inside the Blackstone penthouse, glass walls trembled slightly as rain lashed against them, each droplet chasing the other down in thin, glistening lines. Margaret Chen stood motionless near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection merging with the storm outside. The city lights glittered beneath her feet, but none of it felt like hers anymore. Not the view, not the silence, not even the life she had built over 22 years with Richard Blackstone. The man who now looked at her as if she were a stranger trespassing in his world. Her coat was still damp from the rain, the hem brushing her knees. Her hair pulled back neatly, those strands had come loose during the drive. She had spent the last hour rehearsing what she would say, how she would tell him, how she would deliver the news that should have changed their lives forever. The pregnancy test was still in her purse, wrapped carefully in tissue paper as if it were made of glass. It had been 2 pink lines, 2 soft, undeniable truths that she had stared at until her vision blurred. At 45, she had stopped believing such miracles could happen. Yet here it was, life, new and unexpected, a chance to start again. She had imagined tears in Richard's eyes, imagined his strong arms around her as they talked about nursery colors and names and late-night cravings. She had imagined his smile, that same one that once convinced her they could conquer the world together. But when he came down the curved staircase, tall and immaculate in his dark navy suit, she realized this night would not unfold like any dream she had ever dared to hold. Margaret. He said her name the way one might read a disappointing headline, calm but cold, stripped of warmth or curiosity. You need to pack your things and leave tonight. The words landed between them like a physical blow. For a moment, Margaret thought she had misheard him, that he was angry about something else, another boardroom disagreement, another article questioning his leadership. Richard had always been sensitive about his public image, about control. But his expression was steady, composed, mercilessly clear. He looked like the man she had helped turn into a billionaire, calculated, polished, untouchable. Leave? She repeated softly, still clutching the purse that held her secret. Richard, what are you talking about? He exhaled through his nose as if the conversation were an inconvenience. Jennifer will be moving in tomorrow morning. My attorney will contact you about the divorce proceedings. For a second, the storm outside seemed to go silent. The words Jennifer and moving in echoed in her mind with cruel precision. Jennifer, his assistant, barely 28, with perfect teeth, expensive perfume, and the habit of calling him Mr. Blackstone, even when no one else was around. Margaret had noticed her long ago, the way her hand lingered too long on his arm, the way she looked at him as though he was a god walking among mortals. Margaret had even teased him once about it lightheartedly, not out of jealousy but familiarity. She remembered his laughter then, easy and dismissive, now that memory made her stomach turn. You're divorcing me for your secretary? She said finally, her voice breaking just slightly before she forced it back into control. After 22 years of marriage, Richard? After everything we've built together? Richard's smile was small, sharp, a weapon polished over time. Margaret, you've had a good life. You've lived in luxury. You've benefited from my success. But I need a partner who understands what it takes to keep up with me now. You don't. For years, she had seen him in the headlines. Visionary CEO expands Blackstone Industries. America's favorite power couple attends charity gala. They had built their empire side by side, or so she believed. He had handled the boardrooms. She had handled the people, the investors, the image. She had entertained clients in their home, advised him on mergers, hosted events that shaped the company's network. But in his version of history, she was suddenly invisible, a passenger rather than a driver. While I what, Richard? She asked quietly. While I played house? While I raised funds for your charities? While I built my consulting business from nothing? You think success just happened to me? He tilted his head, his voice cutting like winter wind. You built a small firm, Margaret. A nice hobby. But you're not built for this level anymore. I've evolved. You haven't. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Her consulting firm had just signed a $50 million deal earlier that day, a project that would make her one of the top female business owners in New York. She had called Richard right after the meeting, her voice bright with pride. We did it, she had said. We, because she still thought they were a team. But he hadn't answered. He was too busy planning her erasure. Margaret looked around the living room at the sleek furniture and artwork she had chosen herself, every detail representing years of shared dreams. "You used to say we were unstoppable together," she murmured. "What changed, Richard?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between them said it all. Youth had changed. Power had changed. His ego had outgrown their vows. Margaret turned her gaze back to the rain-streaked window, the city lights reflecting off the marble floor like scattered stars. She remembered the day they moved into this penthouse. They had been younger, hungrier, promising each other forever. She had stood by him through sleepless nights, bad investments, and public scandals. She had been there when he nearly lost everything 15 years ago. When her own inheritance saved the company, her grandmother's $500,000, everything the old woman had ever saved, had been the seed money for Blackstone Industries. She never asked for anything in return because she believed in him, believed in them. "Richard," she said softly, "before you decide that I'm no longer worth keeping, there's something I need to tell you." He raised a hand dismissively, already walking toward his office. "Save it, Margaret. I've made my decision. You'll get a fair settlement." Fair. The word sliced through her composure like glass. Fair after 22 years of partnership. Fair after she'd sacrificed her own dreams to build his empire. She watched him disappear down the hallway, his figure retreating like the final act of a play that had lasted too long. When she was sure he was gone, Margaret finally opened her purse. The pregnancy test lay there, small and fragile. 2 pink lines stared back at her. She felt her throat tighten, her heart throb painfully. This was not the moment she had imagined sharing this news. Not like this. Not standing alone in a home that no longer felt like hers. As thunder cracked above the city, she sat on the edge of the couch and whispered into the empty room. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Richard." Her eyes lifted to the shelves lining the wall behind his desk. They were filled with awards, business books, and framed contracts. The history of Blackstone Industries displayed like a shrine to his ego. Among them was a framed copy of the company's first incorporation document, the one they'd signed together 23 years ago when his dream was just an idea scribbled on napkins, and her inheritance had been the only thing that made it real. Something flickered in her memory then. Her grandmother's lawyer had insisted she be listed as a majority investor to protect her assets, just in case the business failed. At the time, Margaret hadn't cared about the details. She'd signed the paperwork and filed it away, more focused on building their life together than legal percentages. Now, sitting in the ruins of her marriage, that memory took on a different weight. She stood, walked to his office, and pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside were folders labeled with years, acquisitions, and contracts. And there, at the very bottom, yellowed with age but unmistakable, was a manila envelope marked Original Incorporation Documents, Blackstone Industries. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the papers. Her name leapt off the page, Margaret Chen, 51% ownership. Below it, Richard Blackstone, 49%. She stared at the numbers until her eyes burned. The realization came like the first spark of lightning through the dark, sharp, blinding, unstoppable. For 2 decades, she had believed she was the wife of a billionaire. But in truth, she had been the majority owner of his empire all along. Margaret sank into the chair behind his desk, the very seat from which he had dismissed her hours earlier. Her reflection in the glass surface of the desk looked different now, harder, steadier, dangerous in its calm. The world outside was still roaring with rain, but inside her chest the storm had begun to take shape. Richard thought he was removing her from his life, cutting her off, replacing her with a younger version of ambition. He had no idea that the very empire he ruled belonged to her. Margaret looked once more at the paper in her hand, her lips curling into the faintest smile. "You built your empire on my foundation, Richard," she whispered, her voice low and steady. "And now, I'll take it back." Outside, the rain began to ease, the storm clouds thinning to reveal the first shy glow of dawn over the city. The world below carried on as usual, unaware that within the glass walls of one Manhattan penthouse a woman had just found the weapon that would change everything. The wife he had cast aside was no longer his victim. She was about to become his reckoning. The awakening of Margaret Chen. The morning after the storm carried an uneasy stillness, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Sunlight crept cautiously through the clouds, slipping through the penthouse windows and painting thin lines of gold across the marble floor. Margaret Chen sat at the edge of the king-size bed that no longer smelled of lavender or warmth, only of endings. The glass of water on the nightstand was untouched, her reflection faint in its surface. She hadn't slept. She'd spent the entire night reading every word of the incorporation documents she'd found in Richard's desk. Over and over she traced her own signature beside the line that confirmed what she could hardly believe. 51% ownership of Blackstone Industries. It was absurd, almost impossible. Yet the facts were there in black ink, sealed, dated, and filed. She was the majority shareholder, the legal owner of everything Richard had built and flaunted for more than 2 decades. For hours she had tried to piece together how they had both forgotten such a detail. But the truth was simpler than that. He had always believed himself to be the center of the empire, and she had allowed it. She had been content to stay in the background, to let his light shine, never realizing that she had held the very foundation in her hands. Now, as the pale morning settled over Manhattan, the weight of that realization began to transform into something sharper. Not grief, not even anger, but a quiet, burning determination. The betrayal still stung, of course. The image of Richard standing at the staircase, dismissing her like an employee he no longer needed, played on a loop in her mind. The thought of Jennifer, young, eager, whispering plans into his ear, made her stomach twist. But those emotions no longer controlled her. They fueled her. She looked at the manila folder again, the faded ink, the brittle edges of the paper. This was her power now, her truth, her revenge. He had no idea that the empire he thought was his was, in fact, hers. Margaret rose slowly and walked to the window, gazing down at the endless hum of the city. Somewhere out there, Richard was sitting in his office, giving orders, unaware that his reign was already over. The idea made her smile. Not cruelly, but with the clarity of someone who had finally woken from a long, numbing sleep. For 22 years, she had defined herself as Richard's wife, the supportive partner, the quiet strategist behind the throne. But now she understood that she had been the throne all along. Her phone vibrated softly on the dresser, breaking her thoughts. It was a text from an unknown number, one she didn't recognize at first glance, until she saw the message preview and felt the air leave her lungs. "Can't wait for tonight, baby. Finally free of her. See you in our bed soon." The words blurred for a moment before sharpening into cold clarity. It was Jennifer, clearly thinking she was messaging Richard. Margaret's hands trembled, but not from pain. It was disbelief, followed by a low, smoldering rage that spread through her veins. Our bed. The arrogance of it, the audacity. For a moment she imagined Jennifer standing in her penthouse, touching the furniture Margaret had chosen, breathing the air of a life she hadn't earned. Then another vibration and another message. She really never suspected anything, huh? "You're a genius, Richard. Once the divorce is done, we'll restructure everything. She'll get her settlement, and then we can merge with my family's firm. Davidson Corp will finally rise again." Margaret's eyes narrowed as she reread the words. Davidson Corp, Jennifer's family company, a struggling mid-tier consulting firm she'd heard about in passing. So that was the plan. Use Blackstone Industries to absorb Davidson, drain company funds, rewrite history, and erase Margaret completely. The realization struck her not only as betrayal, but as criminal deception. And yet, for the first time, she felt no despair, only clarity. They were so blinded by their greed and arrogance that they hadn't even considered the possibility that she might not be the naive wife they assumed she was. They didn't know she held the one document that could destroy everything they had plotted. She took a deep breath and crossed the room to her phone again. There was one person she trusted implicitly, David Martinez, their longtime attorney. He had handled every legal matter for the Blackstones since the early days, real estate purchases, contracts, even their wills. He was loyal, discreet, and above all meticulous. Margaret had called him countless times over the years for advice, but never like this. She dialed his number with steady fingers, and when he answered, his familiar voice carried the warmth of old friendship. "Margaret, good morning. How are you?" he asked, unaware of the storm behind her calm tone. "David," she said softly, "I need to see you right away. It's urgent. It's about Richard." There was a brief pause on the other end, then his voice lowered with concern. "What happened?" "Richard is divorcing me," she said. The word steady but heavy. And I think I've found something that changes everything. She could hear him shifting in his chair, his tone sharpening. Bring everything you have. My office in an hour. We'll sort it out. When the call ended, Margaret stood in silence for a moment. The penthouse, once filled with laughter and champagne and plans for the future, now felt sterile, almost foreign. She packed deliberately, not with grief but precision. Her laptop, the incorporation papers, a few clothes, and the pregnancy test she still couldn't bear to leave behind. When she caught sight of herself in the mirror, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes were calm but fierce, her posture upright, her face no longer soft with uncertainty. The woman who had been dismissed the night before was gone. In her place stood the rightful owner of Blackstone Industries, and the soon-to-be mother of the child who would inherit it. By the time her car reached David's office downtown, the city was fully awake. The streets crowded with ambition and caffeine. Margaret stepped into the building with her head high, her heels clicking across the marble lobby with the confidence she hadn't felt in years. When she entered his office, David looked up from behind his cluttered desk and immediately rose to greet her. He was in his early 60s, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that had seen more human drama than any courtroom. But as soon as he saw her expression, his smile faded. "Margaret," he said gently, "tell me everything." She placed the manila folder on his desk and opened it carefully, revealing the incorporation papers. "Do you recognize these?" she asked. David adjusted his glasses and scanned the first page. His brow furrowed, then lifted sharply as he reached the ownership section. 51%? "Margaret, do you know what this means?" "I think I do," she said quietly. "But I want to hear it from you." He leaned back in his chair, tapping the papers thoughtfully. "It means legally you are the majority shareholder of Blackstone Industries. Every decision Richard has made for the past 23 years required your authorization as majority owner. If you didn't give it, he's been operating outside the bounds of corporate law. This company isn't his, Margaret, it's yours." For a moment, the room seemed to still completely. Even the ticking of the clock faded into silence. Then David continued, his voice measured but firm. "And if what you're telling me about his plan to divert funds into this Davidson merger is true, that's not just unethical. It's fraud. He could face serious legal consequences." Margaret let out a slow breath. "He thinks he's divorcing me and taking everything, but he doesn't realize he's already working for me." David smiled faintly, admiration flickering in his eyes. "I always knew you were the smarter one in that marriage." Then his tone grew serious again. "Margaret, there's something else you should know. Richard has called an emergency board meeting this morning, 9 a.m., to approve the Davidson acquisition. If he moves forward, he'll effectively transfer millions out of Blackstone's accounts and into a company controlled by his mistress's family. But as majority shareholder, you can block it if you show up." Margaret's pulse quickened, but her voice was steady. "If I go to that meeting, what happens?" "You take control," David said simply. "You announce your position, demand a full audit, and file an injunction against any unauthorized transactions. The board will have no choice but to suspend him pending investigation. By the end of the day, you could be the acting CEO." She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about reclaiming her identity, about showing every woman who had ever been silenced or underestimated that silence was not the same as weakness. When she opened her eyes again, they were clear and focused. "David," she said, her voice calm and resolute, "get the car ready. We're going to the board meeting." He nodded, a proud smile curving his lips. "It's about time, Margaret." As they left the office together, the city outside gleamed with the golden light of late morning. Margaret felt it on her skin like renewal, like awakening. Somewhere across town, Richard was sitting in a glass tower, unaware that the woman he had thrown away was about to walk through his doors and dismantle his empire. Not with anger or scandal, but with the quiet power of truth and the law. For the first time in 22 years, Margaret Chen wasn't following behind anyone. She was leading, and the world was about to remember her name. The boardroom reckoning. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Margaret Chen stepped out into the marble hallway of Blackstone Industries, the empire she had quietly helped build, but never claimed. Her heels struck the floor in a calm, deliberate rhythm, echoing off the glass walls like a heartbeat steady with purpose. The receptionist at the front desk looked up in surprise, her practiced corporate smile faltering when she recognized Margaret. It had been months since Mrs. Blackstone had visited the office, and certainly never unannounced. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackstone," the receptionist stammered, uncertain whether to smile or apologize. "Mr. Blackstone is in a meeting." "I'm aware," Margaret interrupted, her tone polite but firm, the kind of voice that made people instinctively step aside. "I'm here for it." Before the young woman could reply, David Martinez emerged from the elevator behind her, carrying a briefcase and a calm authority of his own. "She's expected," he said, flashing a reassuring smile. The receptionist hesitated for a moment, then picked up her phone to inform the boardroom. But by the time she finished the sentence, Margaret and David were already walking toward the heavy glass doors at the end of the corridor, the doors to the very room where Richard thought he ruled uncontested. Inside, the boardroom was a temple of power: polished oak table, towering windows overlooking Manhattan, and 12 men and women seated in tailored suits, their faces lit by the glow of digital screens. At the head of the table sat Richard Blackstone, exuding confidence in his custom charcoal suit. He was mid-sentence, gesturing toward a holographic display that showed a merger proposal with the Davidson Corporation. His voice, calm and commanding, carried the assurance of a man who believed every eye in the room was his to command. And then the door opened. The room fell silent. The only sound was the quiet hum of the city far below. Margaret stepped inside without hesitation, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. Even the temperature seemed to change, as if the air had grown sharper, more alert. The directors exchanged quick, uneasy glances. Richard turned slowly, his smile freezing mid-motion when he saw her. For a brief moment, something flickered in his expression. Confusion, then irritation, then the faintest hint of fear, though he masked it quickly with a smirk. "Margaret," he said, the practiced charm sliding back into place, "this is unexpected. We're in the middle of a confidential meeting. You should have called." "I'm aware," she said evenly, walking toward the table, "but considering what's being discussed, I thought it best to attend in person." He leaned back in his chair, arms folding casually, pretending composure. "This meeting concerns corporate matters, not personal ones. I don't think this is the place." "On the contrary," she interrupted, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "It concerns me more than anyone here." The directors shifted in their seats. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable. David set his briefcase on the table and began unpacking documents, his movements methodical and precise. Richard's eyes darted briefly to the folder in front of him, the one he had marked Davidson Merger Approval. Margaret stopped at the head of the table, opposite her husband. "Before you proceed with your acquisition, I think it's time we clear up a rather important misunderstanding about ownership." Richard's smirk faltered slightly. "Margaret, this isn't the time for—" She slid a single document across the table, her perfectly manicured fingers releasing it like a card in a high-stakes game. "This," she said, "is the original incorporation filing for Blackstone Industries, dated 23 years ago. You'll notice 2 signatures at the bottom, yours and mine, and just above them you'll see the ownership distribution. Margaret Chen, 51%. Richard Blackstone, 49%. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then a murmur rippled through the boardroom as the directors leaned forward, eyes widening as they read the numbers. Richard's face went pale. "That document is outdated," he said quickly, forcing a chuckle that sounded brittle. "The structure was changed years ago." David raised a hand. "Actually, it wasn't. I verified the filings with the state corporate registry this morning. No amendments, no ownership transfers, no board approval for restructuring. Legally, the majority shareholder of Blackstone Industries remains Mrs. Chen." The silence that followed was thunderous. Margaret's gaze never left Richard's face. She saw the calculation flickering behind his eyes, the desperate scramble for control, the quiet realization that his empire, the one he had weaponized against her, had never been his to begin with. One of the board members, a woman named Clara Evans, finally broke the silence. "Mrs. Chen, are you saying you hold controlling interest in Blackstone Industries?" Margaret nodded. "I am. And as of this morning, I am exercising my right as majority shareholder to halt any and all pending acquisitions, including the Davidson merger. Effective immediately, I am requesting a full audit of company finances and board decisions made without my authorization." The boardroom erupted in low whispers, papers shifting, chairs creaking. Richard slammed his palm on the table. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "Margaret doesn't understand the business. She's never been involved in day-to-day operations. She doesn't have the experience to what?" She cut in, her voice quiet but deadly. "To read a balance sheet, to understand corporate law, or to recognize a fraudulent transaction when I see one." She turned to the board, her calm gaze sweeping over each of them. "Over the past year, Mr. Blackstone has been coordinating with an outside party, the Davidson Corporation, to execute a merger that would have redirected millions of company funds into a failing private entity owned by his mistress's family. I have copies of messages, transactions, and internal proposals that prove this. I also have confirmation from my attorney that such actions constitute corporate fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. I don't think I need to explain the consequences." Gasps filled the room. Several directors exchanged alarmed looks, others visibly distancing themselves from Richard. His composure began to crack. "You can't prove any of that," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. David placed another document on the table, a printed copy of Jennifer's text messages and the merger drafts. "We can," he said calmly, "and we will." Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward the papers like a man staring at his own noose. "Margaret," he said, lowering his voice, "you don't know what you're doing. This isn't a game. You're putting everything we built at risk." She smiled faintly, and there was no warmth in it. "Everything we built? You mean everything I own?" The boardroom went silent again, but this time it was a silence heavy with shifting power. The directors could feel it. The balance had changed permanently. Margaret turned to them, her tone transforming from personal confrontation to executive authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, effective immediately, I am assuming interim control of Blackstone Industries pending the completion of the audit. Mr. Blackstone's decision-making authority is suspended until the board concludes its review. We will not allow this company's legacy to be tarnished by greed or corruption." The oldest director, a man named Halpern who had known the Blackstones from the beginning, nodded solemnly. "I move to second that." "Seconded," came another voice, followed by several nods around the table. Richard rose suddenly, his face flushed with anger. "You can't do this. I'm the CEO. This is my company." Margaret met his fury with calm certainty. "No, Richard," she said softly. "This was our company. You just forgot which of us made it possible." He took a step toward her, his voice lowering, dangerous. "You think you can walk in here and destroy everything? You'll regret this, Margaret. You'll regret all of it." Her eyes were steady, unflinching. "The only thing I regret," she said, "is not remembering sooner who I was." Richard's glare hardened into something cold and venomous, but he said nothing more. Security arrived moments later, summoned discreetly by one of the assistants. They didn't touch him, but their presence was enough. The man who had once commanded entire boardrooms with his voice now stood powerless before the woman he had dismissed as irrelevant. He straightened his tie, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out without another word. The door closed behind him with a final echoing click. The board sat in stunned silence for a long moment before Margaret finally exhaled. "We have work to do," she said simply. "Let's get started." As the meeting dissolved into motion, David leaned close to her and whispered, "You handled that perfectly. Are you all right?" She nodded, her expression calm but her eyes gleaming with something fierce and unstoppable. "For the first time in a long time," she said, "I'm more than all right." From the panoramic window behind her, the city stretched out in endless promise. A skyline built on ambition and reinvention. The same skyline that had once symbolized Richard's dominance now reflected Margaret's rebirth. The storm that had torn her life apart had not destroyed her. It had revealed her strength. And as she stood there, surrounded by the empire she now truly controlled, one thought echoed through her mind like a vow. He thought he ended me, but I was only just beginning. When she stepped off the stage, David met her with quiet pride. "You've done it," he said. "You've rebuilt everything he tried to take." Margaret smiled, her hand once again brushing her stomach. "Not everything," she said softly. "Some things were never his to take." As they left the building together, the evening sky over Manhattan began to clear, painted in hues of violet and gold. The city hummed with life, unaware that somewhere above its rooftops, a woman who had been cast aside only weeks earlier now stood as a symbol of resilience, intelligence, and rebirth. The empire had been reclaimed, not through vengeance but through grace. And the woman who once walked away in the rain had returned, not as someone's wife, not as someone's victim, but as herself, whole and unstoppable. The woman who owned her destiny. 6 months had passed since that stormy October night, when Margaret Chen had stood in her penthouse with rain dripping from her coat and her world collapsing around her. 6 months since she had watched her husband of 22 years throw away everything they had built together for the illusion of youth and power. And 6 months since she had discovered that beneath all his arrogance and deceit, she had been the one holding the true foundation of everything. Now, as spring sunlight bathed the skyline of Manhattan in soft gold, Margaret stood at the tall windows of her office, looking out at the city that once symbolized his triumph and now reflected hers. Blackstone Industries had transformed under her leadership. The company that had teetered on the edge of scandal and ruin had been reborn with integrity, innovation, and vision. The toxic culture Richard had cultivated, the fear, the favoritism, the blind loyalty, had dissolved into something entirely new. Departments that had once operated in isolation now collaborated. Employee satisfaction surveys soared. Investors spoke of a Blackstone renaissance, crediting its new direction to Margaret's steady and visionary hand. Even the media, once hungry for her downfall, now treated her as an icon of resilience, writing profiles with titles like "The Woman Who Took Back the Empire" and "From Betrayal to Billionaire." How Margaret Chen rewrote her legacy. But success had never been the point. Margaret didn't wake each morning driven by revenge or pride. She woke with a quiet sense of purpose, the kind that came from surviving something that should have broken her, and realizing she had emerged stronger than she ever knew. The storm had stripped her bare, and in that bareness she had found her truth. The woman who had once lived in someone else's shadow now created her own light. As she reviewed the latest quarterly report, David Martinez entered her office, smiling in that way he did when he had both good news and something amusing to share. "The audit is officially closed," he said, setting the final report on her desk. "The board unanimously voted to make your position permanent. You are now officially and publicly the CEO of Blackstone Industries. No acting title, no conditions." Margaret looked up from her papers, her smile serene but genuine. "Thank you, David," she said, "for everything. I couldn't have done any of this without you." He chuckled softly. "Oh, I think you could have. But I'm glad I was here to witness it. You've turned this company into something extraordinary, Margaret. Even I'm starting to believe in corporate redemption stories." She smiled, but her eyes were distant for a moment, lost in thought. "Redemption is a strange thing," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's not about being forgiven by others. It's about forgiving yourself for not seeing your own worth sooner." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Speaking of forgiveness," he said, "I have an update about Richard." Her gaze sharpened slightly, though her tone remained calm. "What about him?" "He's been indicted on charges of fraud and embezzlement," David said carefully. "The investigation uncovered additional evidence. Funds diverted to offshore accounts, falsified contracts, insider deals. He's facing prison time, Margaret, and he's not doing well." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. She simply looked out the window, watching sunlight glint off the Hudson River, the city alive with motion below. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no trace of gloating. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and reflective. "He built his life around winning," she said softly. "But he never understood that the real victory isn't about owning things. It's about owning yourself." "I don't hate him anymore. I just pity him," David nodded. "That's why you're the better person," he said simply. "He's been indicted on charges of fraud and embezzlement," David said carefully. "The investigation uncovered additional evidence. Funds diverted to offshore accounts, falsified contracts, insider deals. He's facing prison time, Margaret, and he's not doing well." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. She simply looked out the window, watching sunlight glint off the Hudson River, the city alive with motion below. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no trace of gloating. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and reflective. "He built his life around winning," she said softly. "But he never understood that the real victory isn't about owning things. It's about owning yourself." "I don't hate him anymore. I just pity him," David nodded. That's why you're the better person, he said simply. After he left, Margaret sat alone for a while, letting the silence settle around her. She thought back to that night she'd found the pregnancy test in her purse. 2 pink lines that had changed everything. Her hand drifted to her stomach, now round and full beneath her silk blouse. The baby kicked gently, a quiet reminder of life, of new beginnings. It still astonished her sometimes, this second chance at motherhood, this tiny heartbeat growing stronger each day. The doctor called it a miracle, and maybe it was. Or maybe it was life's way of reminding her that endings are rarely the end. That evening, she left the office early, something she rarely did before. The city was glowing with sunset, the streets buzzing with the rhythm of Friday life. She had no chauffeur waiting. She preferred to drive herself now, to feel the city as it moved, to remember that she was part of it, not apart from it. Her penthouse, once a symbol of luxury and loneliness, had transformed into a sanctuary of peace. Gone were the cold marble statues and sterile art. In their place were warmth, simplicity, and softness. The nursery was nearly finished, painted in pale cream and sunlight yellow. The walls adorned with watercolor clouds and framed photographs of her family. As she walked through the quiet rooms, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was an unknown number again, but instinct told her who it was before she even looked. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then answered. Margaret. The voice was rougher than she remembered, older, thinner, like a man hollowed out by his own choices. Richard, she said, her tone even. There was a pause, then a sigh on the other end. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said. I needed to hear your voice. I've lost everything. The company, the house, the friends, and even Jennifer left. She took what little money I had left and disappeared. I don't even blame her. I became someone I don't recognize. I thought I was powerful. I thought I was untouchable. Margaret stood by the window, her eyes on the city lights flickering far below. You thought power came from control, she said quietly. But real power doesn't come from taking. It comes from giving. It comes from knowing who you are even when no one else sees it. There was a silence so long she wondered if he'd hung up. Then softly he said, You always deserved better than me. I did, she said, not cruelly but with truth. But I don't hate you for that. I just learned not to wait for someone else to see my worth. When she ended the call, there were no tears. There was only peace, a stillness that came from knowing she had faced the worst and found herself unbroken. She poured herself a cup of tea and stood by the nursery door, gazing at the gentle glow of the lamp inside. For the first time in years, her future didn't frighten her. It inspired her. 2 months later, on a clear summer morning, the sound of a baby's cry filled that penthouse. The nurses smiled. The doctor congratulated her, and Margaret, holding her newborn daughter against her chest, felt the world shift again. This time, not in loss, but in love. The child's skin was soft, her eyes curious, and when Margaret looked down at her, she felt an emotion so deep it brought tears to her eyes. She whispered softly, Welcome home, my little miracle. In the months that followed, life found its rhythm. Margaret balanced motherhood and leadership with the grace of someone who had learned that control and peace were not opposites. They were allies. The board respected her not just for her intelligence, but for her empathy. Under her guidance, Blackstone Industries became not only more profitable, but more humane. She launched mentorship programs for women in business, scholarships for underprivileged students, and initiatives to support mothers re-entering the workforce. Every decision she made carried a piece of her story. A story of rising from betrayal, reclaiming power and transforming pain into purpose. One afternoon, as she walked through the company's main lobby, she noticed a young intern struggling to balance a stack of papers and a laptop. Margaret stopped to help her, the girl stammering nervously as she realized who was standing beside her. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Chen, I didn't mean to. It's all right, Margaret said kindly, helping her gather the papers. I was young and overwhelmed once too. Remember this, mistakes don't define you. What you do after them does. The girl nodded, her eyes wide with gratitude. And as Margaret walked away, she realized that maybe that was her legacy. Not the empire, not the billions, but the quiet lessons she could leave behind for others to find their strength sooner than she had. That evening, she took her daughter to the park, where the air smelled of blooming flowers and distant laughter. She sat on a bench beneath a tall oak tree, the same one where she and Richard had once planned their future when they were young and hopeful. The irony made her smile, but there was no bitterness in it anymore. The wind rustled softly through the branches, the world moving on as it always did. Margaret looked down at her daughter, who was watching a butterfly dance in the fading light. "Do you see that?" she whispered. "That's what freedom looks like. It doesn't ask for permission. It just flies." The baby cooed and Margaret smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. For a long while she simply sat there, letting the moment sink into her bones, the peace, the joy, the quiet triumph. The woman who had once been cast out had built not just a company, but a life that was entirely her own. When the first stars appeared in the sky, Margaret rose, holding her daughter close, her silhouette framed against the city that had witnessed her every fall and every rise. She whispered one last truth, not to anyone else, but to herself. "I lost everything they said mattered," she said softly, "and I found everything that actually did." And as she walked away beneath the silver light of the evening, the empire she had rebuilt gleamed behind her, not as a monument to wealth or revenge, but as a living reminder that no storm, no betrayal, no heartbreak can destroy a woman who finally remembers her own worth. The end.